Yeah, we didn't tell you you had to study.
You're talking about the wind, right? We have a lot of trees. Right. Oh, really? I'm just waiting for that to happen.
Positioning myself.
Exactly. Yeah, I can't see what we can see. All right, I think, do we have Zoom up? Okay, awesome. I think we can go ahead and get going. Thank you so much for spending your Thursday evening with us. I'm a nerd, so I always love talking about climate change issues. So I appreciate it when I have people to talk with about it. Our agenda here today is, it's of course informal. So, definitely feel free to ask questions or talk in the middle of it, but we do definitely want to have Q&A at the end. So we'll try to pace ourselves to make sure we have conversation time. But what we were looking at is first introductions, who we are. Second, talking a little bit about what is a carbon footprint. And we're gonna hit there first because it relates to our pop quizzes that we're gonna have through the presentation. Just little space givers here. Then we're gonna talk a little bit about what is this thing called climate change. We're then gonna hit on what does climate change mean for Stillwater. We're going to talk a little bit about what does it mean, what are the risks, what does it mean to be climate resilient, what communities can do to be climate resilient, and then a little bit of case study sort of discussion about Maplewood, and then some observations specific to Stillwater. So we're aiming just for a broad crowd. We can get in deeper into any of those topics that you want. So with that, we'll go ahead and get going. My clicker is now not clicking. That's interesting. Awesome, thank you so much. So we can introduce ourselves. I'll let Sean introduce her.
Thank you, Sean Finwell. I am the environmental planner with the city of Maplewood. And I also wanted to let you know that I'm a resident of Stillwater, so I'm proud to be here. I've been with the city of Maplewood for 21 years. I actually started out long ago as a city planner, and then they created the environmental planner position in approximately 2007. So I've been working on environmental initiatives for the city of Maplewood since that time. Oh, and another fun disclosure, I grew up in Maplewood. So that is my story, and I've been working with Ted on some climate and energy planning for many years now. So glad to be here. Thank you.
Awesome, thanks, Sean. So I'm Ted Redmond. I am with Pale Blue Dot. I am an architect and an urban planner. And a little bit about Pale Blue Dot. We are a small consultancy, and our mission is to hasten the transition to a carbon-free economy and elevate the public discourse. We do sustainability planning and renewable energy planning, but largely we do climate planning. We've done 50-some energy and climate projects in 22 states. A lot of that is in Minnesota and Wisconsin, but some nationally as well. So as I said, we were going to start off a little bit about carbon footprint. What is a carbon footprint? So the carbon footprint is the amount of greenhouse gas that we produce through the activities in our life. This little breakdown sort of shows the typical American carbon footprint breakdown: 34% in transportation, 29% in housing, 13% based on what we eat, which varies depending on what we eat. Goods and service, goods are about 12%, services are also about 12%. Yes?
Quick question. I'm never sure when we talk about transportation's percentage, what's included in that? Jets, etc.
Yes.
All four.
Yes, all forms of mobility. Yeah. So that would include, you know, clearly if we're biking and walking, we're tucking that down, but it's our cars and our planes. It would also technically include like train travel, but frankly, in the United States, we track train travel not as well at a local level. We track it really well at the national level, but not very well at the local level. So the average human on Earth has about a 4 metric ton carbon footprint annually. The average Minnesotan's about 20 metric tons. So you can see, I mean, we know that in the United States, our carbon footprint is quite a bit higher than other countries. And as I've said, we have, oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry, go back to the last slide. So that's 20 for Minnesota, but what's the national average? for the
National-
United States?
National is going to be darn close to about the same. I think it's like 21 and some change. And they vary. This number is actually going to be a few years old now. This is probably from 2017, 2018, when we did this first. So they change year by year.
I
Yes.
think it's gone up. Exactly.
Yeah, so my question similarly, right away, I thought, is Minnesota any different than the United States? Yes.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think, so it's very regionally variable, right? Folks in Stillwater are going to have certain profiles that might be different from outstate, just related to transportation needs and availability of different resources and so forth. But in general, the upper Midwest, we tend to be heavier on our housing because we're burning fuel during the winter more than, say, Alabama or, you know. Although they tend to burn, when you get further south, they're burning more air conditioning. But typically the footprint for air conditioning in many states is a little bit better of a profile than heating, because we're burning natural gas in most instances for heating. So there are nuances like that, kind of regionally. This number, by the way, does not include what we would call scope 3. So when we do like carbon footprinting at a community scale, there are 3 scopes. Scope 1 is what you burn yourself, you know, like gas in my car, natural gas in my house. Scope 2 is what's burned on your behalf, like at the electric plant, so that we can use electricity, the coal that's burned there. That's a scope 2. Scope 3 then is, in terms of personal footprint, is then related to things that we purchase. So those numbers, the 20 metric tons, does not include scope 3 for most folks. When we start including that, it's going to go up into the 30s or 40s per person, which is a little tough because a family of 4, I mean, are the kids consuming or is it the adults? I mean, how do you, so you usually do that based on family. Yes, sir.
Is the housing number all buildings?
I'm sorry?
The housing number just housing, or is it commercial office, retail?
That would be just your personal housing situation. So not like, it wouldn't include your business footprint or when you go to work. So those are,
Adds up to almost 100%. So where are the buildings?
I'm sorry,
Where are the buildings, the other buildings?
this would be on
Versus
personal
the person?
footprint.
Oh,
Yeah,
okay.
yeah. Well, I've got some community numbers in the
Okay.
later on. Okay, so we talked about a pop quiz. We've got our beginning here.
Yes, so this is exciting. Just to keep things interesting, we only have 4 questions, so it won't be that hard. And we have prizes. And we ask that you write your answer on the card that I've given you. If you could hand that gentleman a card. So, number 1. So this is Let's Drop Some Pounds, a game that tests the weight of your carbon footprint knowledge. So question number 1.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So an average Minnesotan family of 4's diet produces how much greenhouse gases annually? So we have A, 12,000 pounds. I like Christmas cookies. Who doesn't? 22,000 pounds is C. D is 53,000 pounds. And E is 106,000 pounds. So we'll give you just a moment to touch on that. And again, we have some prizes at the end of the session here. We'll call out and see who has the most correct answers and hand these out. Thanks.
Right. We got our answers written down. Something like it. Okay. All right. So now a little bit about what this thing we call climate change, which, by the way, I usually like to mention. I love starting with this slide. By the way, I'm a part of the Climate Reality project, so some of these slides I nabbed from the Climate Reality project. So just full disclosure there. But I love starting with the slide because, first of all, I love views of Earth from space anyways, because it's just amazing. But it really highlights the whole idea of how thin our atmosphere is, what a tiny little shellac it is on top of. It is basically the thickness of shellac on a basketball. So if you take a basketball and put shellac on it, that's our atmosphere. So we think of it as massive, but it's because we're dinky. So I always love starting with that image because it kind of puts it in perspective. So the role of greenhouse gases. So of course, our atmosphere is made up of both greenhouse gases and not greenhouse gases. Greenhouse gases make up the vast majority of our atmosphere, 99.96%. Includes nitrogen, oxygen, and argon. The thing about non-greenhouse gases is that they do not react to visible light, nor do they react to infrared light. So what happens is sunlight comes from the sun, travels through space, goes through our atmosphere because our atmosphere, the non-greenhouse gases don't interfere with visible light. When the visible light strikes the earth, it warms it up and turns it into infrared energy. The infrared energy then bounces off of the earth back into space through non-greenhouse gases because it doesn't interact with infrared energy. Greenhouse gases, though, which are mostly carbon dioxide, there's also methane, nitrous oxide, and ozone. They make up only 0.04% of our atmosphere, so it's a tiny amount of our atmosphere. By the way, water vapor is also a greenhouse, functions as a greenhouse gas. It's a special case though, because water vapor is highly variable and it's dependent on the other greenhouse gases. So the more greenhouse gases we have, the more water vapor we uptake. So it's a special case condition. But the unique thing about greenhouse gases is that like non-greenhouse gases, they do not interfere or interact with visible light. So that means sunlight passes through them unhindered, doesn't cause any problem whatsoever. However, once the sunlight hits the earth and turns into infrared energy, it does get interacted with by the greenhouse gases, which means that it deflects a large portion of energy back to the earth. So the more greenhouse gases we have in our atmosphere, the more deflection of our infrared energy we get back on the earth. We can observe this happening pretty easily just simply by looking at the moon. Our average temperature on Earth, if we did not have greenhouse gases, if we had no greenhouse gases, it would be close to that of the moon. A little bit different because we do have some volcanic activity in the Earth's core, so that would warm things up a bit. But if it weren't for the greenhouse gas atmosphere, we'd be close to the Earth, which has an average temperature of 0. Earth's average temperature has been 56 degrees for eons. So that gives you a sense of what that 0.04% has done for the Earth's climate. We now, though, are at 59 degrees and counting. This is a few years old, so we're actually a little bit over that. Another way we can observe this in action is just looking at some of the other planets in our solar system and their relationship to their temperature, average surface temperature, and their atmosphere. We've got Mercury, which of course is super close to the sun, at a blistering 333 degrees average temperature, has no atmosphere, super close to the sun, bakes all day long. Next up, we've got Venus, which has a massive greenhouse gas atmosphere, super thick in comparison to the Earth's. It's much further away from the sun than of course, Mercury. Its temperature, though, is almost 900 degrees average surface temperature. And it's all because of the greenhouse gas effect. And of course, Earth at our average 59 now, and then Mars with a measly, tiny, itty bitty atmosphere at negative 85. So just the relationship between those three planets help to illustrate what greenhouse gas does to heat up our atmosphere. And a lot of people will say, well, how can 0.04% make a difference? It's such a tiny number. It's ridiculous to think that tiny amounts, and we add a little bit more to a tiny amount, that can't make any difference. Well, there are a number of situations where tiny amounts make a big difference in a system. Of course, 0.04% in blood alcohol makes a big difference in how the system of the human body works. It's also about the same level of steroids, by the way, which of course makes a big difference in how the human system works. So that's biological, but basically we're talking about a giant, interbiological sort of system, and it's just an illustration of how tiny amounts make a big difference. Another thing I like to point out is if you think of a waiting room that has room for 10 people in it, and if you send one additional person per hour into the waiting room, it doesn't take long until the waiting room is overflowing with people. So the atmosphere has so much space for greenhouse gases. In order for it to have a balanced system, the more greenhouse gas we put into it, we start having it overflowing, right? So it's small amounts can make a big difference. CO2 is now being released at a faster pace than any time in the last 66 million years, which is really kind of amazing. The other thing that I like to point out is people get very confused over, well, I'm breathing CO2, so I'm a problem, or that's ridiculous. Well, of course, what we're really talking about is CO2 that's being added into the system out of what we call the slow carbon cycle as opposed to the fast carbon cycle. Fast carbon cycle, trees and people and animals breathe and respirate. We take in oxygen, we release carbon dioxide. That is not really the problem. The problem is when we're taking glacial, geologic carbon that's been locked in the geology for millennia, and we're burning it. We're pulling it out of the earth in the form of fossil fuels. It's been locked into the geological system, into the slow carbon cycle. Under natural conditions, it would only be released in the time frame of millennia, and we're burning it in the time frame of a century. Right? So that's the issue that's driving the change. So we don't need to worry about breathing or things like that. What we need to worry about is burning the fossil fuels. Of course, there are other things that we can do to damage, like getting rid of forests and so forth. Those are also issues and considerations, but the main driver is fossil fuel. So the carbon cycle, over many, many millennia, eons, it does go through a cycle. It is natural to have a cycle in the carbon cycle. It relates to the rotation of the earth and how the planets move around. I mean, all those, the dance of the solar system. But it has stayed very consistently between 180 parts per million and 280 parts per million for quite a while. That relates very closely to our historic average temperatures. Also, you can see that they're very closely related. Also has been very stable within a zone. Since the Industrial Revolution, though, we have gone up. This says 412. We're past that now. This is a couple of years old. I'm sorry about that. But we're past 400 parts per million now, and our temperature now is we're pushing 60 degrees average, which is well outside the boundary of that traditional cycle. In the next 40 years, if we do not stop our fossil fuel consumption, we're going to be at 60 parts per million or higher. So it doesn't take a lot for us to start thinking about what does that mean for that temperature, because it will follow. We know that they relate to each other. All of this does have a consequence. The 19 of the 20 hottest years on record, these are global records, not necessarily Minnesota, it might be different for the state. But globally, the 19 of the 20 hottest records have happened since 2002. That's amazing. And the last 7 are the hottest of all of them. That's pretty phenomenal. And basically it's because all of the emissions that we're putting out there are baked into the system. So it just helps us understand that we have to drop some pounds.
So all this material is very upsetting, but I'm here to say, let's think about the positive. What are some little things that we can do? Like a meatless Monday, I've been trying to cut down on more, having more veggies and so forth. So let's take a look. Having one meatless day each week, the average Minnesotan household could save about 200 pounds of carbon dioxide annually. So we're asking, is that true or false? And you'll find out at the end.
So the beginning is a little heavy, but I like to set it up about the need, the urgency for action. Now we can start talking about what can we do? And there's a lot that we can do. So, all right, I'll just stop. I usually ramble. I like to make sure to see if there's any questions. Yes.
You think 2021 will be in your top 7 now? I guess top 8.
I suspect so, yeah. Yeah, definitely in the United States. When we and Minnesota, yeah, because if you look at just almost every month has had warmer than average temperatures. Some of them pretty significantly. So, and in fact, that's kind of a little segue. I don't know if any of you have seen these. This is beautiful artwork, climate stripes. This is Minnesota's climate stripes. So if it's a light blue, it means it's barely under the average temperature over a 30-year time span. If it's a lightish kind of a orange, it means it's barely over the average. If it's a dark blue, it's under the average temperature. And if it's a red, it's over the average temperature. And so you can see that since the Industrial Revolution, Minnesota has been getting hotter. It's definitely leaning towards the recent past year, which just underscores that last slide. In terms of impacts for Stillwater, these numbers, by the way, are sort of for the county. So they're not zeroed in Stillwater specific, but pretty close. So to date, we've seen about 1.62 degrees increase. That's since 1980. We've seen more when we look at it through the Industrial Revolution. We've seen an increase in precipitation of about 4.3%. We've seen about a 34% increase in heavy precipitation. So that's rain events of an inch or more in one event. We've seen an increase in days above 95 degrees of about 2. That's an important temperature, by the way, because at 95 degrees, we stop cooling down. It's impossible for us to cool down. And 95-degree days often also are, they bring with them hot nights. And we can anticipate that there are vulnerable folks that maybe don't have air conditioning or have other sort of health considerations, asthma, et cetera. Those are dangerous days for a lot of folks. So it's an important date number to track. And we've seen a decrease in days with freezing. As we look into the future, the daily maximum temperature, these charts are a little bit goofy to read, but basically the blue line as a projection of the future is if we meet our carbon reduction goals from the Paris Accord. The red line is essentially business as usual. We do not meet our carbon reduction goals globally. Then the sort of cones, there's a blue cone, they overlap, so it ends up being purple, but you can see kind of that bluish cone and the red cone. That is the variability. So that is how much variability we can anticipate as we move into the future. The models tell us that really, it's not so much about the increased temperature. I mean, 3 or 4 degrees, you hear that a lot. Well, that's a couple of degrees. That feels good to me. I like another 6 degrees. That'd be great. But it isn't just about the warmer temperature. It's about the greater increase in variability. And this month is a wonderful example of exactly what that means, where we have, we went from an overwarm November into a sudden snap of being really quite cold. And then it got warm again. Then we have a tornado touchdown in the state, and then it gets cold again. I mean, it's that variability that we can expect to increase over time. And then looking forward, we can also anticipate an increase in the days above 95. That shows by the end of the century into the pushing about 50 on average. It could go as high as 100. That's, again, that cone of potential. So that's quite something. So that just sort of summarizes looking forward, up to 12 degrees in temperature. Rainfall, the models vary quite significantly. But what all of the models agree on is, again, increased variability. So that means, and it also, they all agree on the idea that rainfall events are going to spread apart. We're going to get rain less frequently. We're going to get more time between our rainfalls. That's already started to happen. And that means that when we do get a rainfall, our rains are going to be heavier. So we're going to be seeing about a 30% increase yet in heavy precipitation. And those two things together mean that we're going to see an increase in drought potential and an increase in heavy rainfall potential, which sounds counterintuitive, but they relate to each other because of that relationship of pulling apart the rain events. Both of those add up to a significant flash flood concern. When you dry out the earth, rain on it doesn't absorb as well. Flooding will become more of an issue as we move forward, particularly in a flash flood sort of a situation where we're not used to that. We don't have as much flash flood events, but that's something to be thinking about. Severe weather, in the last 70 years, Washington, again, this is Washington County, but Washington County has had 17 federal disaster declarations in the last 70 years. 50% of them have been in the last 20 years. Looking at other severe weather events, since 1981, from 1981 to 2001, there are 130 severe weather events recorded by NOAA. Between 2001 and 21, there have been 317 severe weather events, the same categories of severe weather events. So it's an increase of 144% in that 20 to 20 year period. And since 2001, we've had an average of about $1.8 million in property damage in the county annually, and 0.2 deaths. There was 4 deaths associated with severe weather in those 20 years. So another thing I like to sort of position in terms of understanding climate change is I think about it in terms of movement. We often associate climate with where we are on the globe, which makes sense. We think of hot weather down south. So between now and the middle of the century, which is now just a couple decades away, we can anticipate the weather for Stillwater being similar to what it is about 240 to 360 miles south of here. So that's literally like picking up Stillwater and moving it south 12 miles every year over the next 30 years, or about 173 feet a day. So picking it up and moving it almost a city block every day is what the experience of our weather is going to be. Through the end of the century, if we do not curb our emissions, it'll be similar to living in Denison, Texas in the summer. Average temperature 92. So what are the risks associated with these things? The primary risks relate to extreme weather and extreme temperatures and the variability of those. So the experience of it varying. Flood, as I've talked about, both overshore flooding, but more important in my mind, flash flooding, having water appear down a road in a backyard where we didn't expect it in our basement. Air quality considerations, vector-borne and waterborne disease considerations, food insecurity, water quality, and power failure. The number one reason for power failure in Minnesota is trees falling on top of power lines. I think the second one might be squirrels, and it's a pretty distant second. Squirrels aren't good. We're going to have more squirrel problems, but we can anticipate more tree problems because as we get that drought, roots dry out, you get a heavy rain, big trees want to tip over. So we can anticipate more of that. There are secondary related risks, which I call out as economic risks that are going to vary from community to community. Things like agriculture yield, mortality, energy costs. We can anticipate our energy costs going up. And property crime and violent crime. There's been really good studies that help to quantify those on a county by county basis, actually. Yes.
Sorry. I was just going to ask if, so I heard that Minnesota can become a climate haven for people that in lower states migrate up north this way. Would that be a risk to the economy almost because of influx? They were not ready for that.
Absolutely, and I didn't put one of those slides in there, but there's good studies actually that project out what some of that could be. And I think they might be under projecting, but everybody's doing good faith and everybody's trying to get a handle on what might happen. But there's a good study by a group out of Stanford. And they project it on a county by county basis throughout the country. And Washington County, it would see an influx is what's being anticipated. Not as heavily as And this is where I think the models are wrong. They tend to assume that if you live in a coastal state and you're moving because of sea level rise, they're assuming that you might just move inland, 100 or 200 miles. I think that's actually a wrong assumption. I think people will decide to move to a different metro area, because if I'm going to pick up and move 300 miles, well, I mean, I could move 1,000 miles, what difference does it make? So I think they might be a little bit soft on those. But I often point that out as it's risk and opportunity, because if we anticipate these things, and it's true of all of these things, if we can anticipate these things and move to make corrections, we can turn them into opportunities. And the same thing with the migration. If we don't anticipate it, and then suddenly there's lots of people that are trying to move into the region, that could create a little bit of havoc. So, and I also just like to point out that these risks are not equally felt by everybody. I mean, we're all vulnerable to our climate. I mean, we can all get flooded. We can all have heat stroke. I mean, we can all experience these things. But of course, there are those amongst us that are more vulnerable than the average based on all sorts of life situations. So the categories that are recommended for us to look at from the US climate assessment are children, especially those under 5. So think of, I can't steer myself. I have to have an adult help me get places. Older adults, which they say older adults over 65, and every year that gets me a little bit more. Like, well, maybe it's a little higher than 65, but that's what they say, it's 65. So I guess that's older adult now. Individuals with disabilities, those in economic stress, people of color, at-risk workers, think of first responders, construction workers, people out in the elements. Those that have food security concerns, and individuals with limited mobility. So that means that while we do climate adaptation planning, we always want to make sure that we address their concerns.
I'm back for a little positive reinforcement here. So I moved to Stillwater. The #1 reason was because of its walkability. And I've lived here 3 years now and have really enjoyed walking downtown and going to the restaurants. And that's something we're striving for and working for with the city of Maplewood, at least as far as connecting trails. We're trying to kind of revitalize an area that used to be our old downtown, but you have a real gem. We have a real gem here in Stillwater as a walkable community, so we shall be proud of that. But one way we can all help reduce our carbon footprint, of course, is by reducing our driving. So question number 3. How many miles does an average Minnesotan drive in a year? 12,000, 8,000 miles, 2,000 miles, I like Santa's sleigh, or 2 miles? And you'll hear the answer at the end. Thank you.
Thanks, Sean. Okay. Any questions on any of that I just talked about? All right, so what is climate resilience? Now let's start getting into some a little bit more positive bent. I promised to be more positive, so we can start getting there. Okay, so resilience is the ability to anticipate risk, limit its impact, and bounce back rapidly through survival, adaptation, evolution, and growth in the face of turbulent change. Resilience is not hazard mitigation. So all communities in the state of Minnesota and counties have hazard mitigation plans. Hazard mitigation plans are extremely important. So it's an important part of our infrastructure. But resilience and hazard mitigation are not the same. Basically, we're aiming towards focusing on the underlying causes, the vulnerabilities to the hazards, not just the hazards themselves. So it's a little bit nuanced. And resilience, a community, we want to focus on community stressors. So community stressors are an event which negatively impacts a community physically, emotionally, or economically. Stressors differ by communities, but examples of them include man-made disasters, so terrorism, things like that. Natural disasters, so crazy weather, earthquakes, wildfires, and climate change, which of course can also feed into that second category, but has its own category related to raising temperatures, increasing frequency of extreme weather, etc. So typically, climate change is not accounted for in municipal planning. As we try to, all communities are always trying to work very hard to plan for their community, to figure out how to make the community more livable, weather considerations. And our hazard mitigation plans always include natural disasters and man-made disasters. Typically, they do not address climate change, which is a multiplying effect of those other considerations. I think my clicker stopped clicking. Okay, so from my perspective, and I think this is a given through lots of practitioners, climate resilience should address both mitigation and adaptation. And the reason for that, while it's dancing a little bit, the reason for mitigation and adaptation is, in my mind, mitigation is the first adaptation. But a little bit about what they are. So mitigation reduces our contributions to climate change. So let's stop burning fossil fuels. Let's reduce our collective carbon footprint. So in my mind, that is the #1 adaptation thing that we can do where we sit right now. Because what we do today is going to affect 2100. And so if we do not want to have a future that has almost 100 days of 95-degree days of 95 degrees in Stillwater, we should reduce our emissions now so that we avoid that. So that's the #1 adaptation measure. Adaptation is developing ways to protect people and places by reducing their vulnerability. So, and there's all sorts of things that we can do related to that, and I'll go through a bit. The first thing that a community can do for that is plan for it. And of course, I'm a planner, so why wouldn't I think that? So I know there's lots of other things folks can do, but I think planning is important because it helps you put a handle on the scope of what wants to get done and then prioritize. Because we'll all have limited resources, and so we want to make sure our limited resources go to the greatest opportunities. Right? So planning for it helps us do that. My observation on what successful climate action or sustainability plans are, I think that they all have a few characteristics. The first is that they're all grounded in science. So having an understanding of what the options are, having some data. I like the saying, without data, you're just another person with an opinion. And I think there are lots of folks in communities that will respond to that. I want to understand why you think we should do A, B, and C. Well, if you've got a little bit of data to at least help support it, it's beneficial. So making sure it's grounded in data and science, leveraging broad stakeholder wisdom, which means putting together a group of people that aren't just the folks that typically we hear from and aren't just the folks that have knowledge about these things, but have folks that have different perspectives about the community is very important. Recognizing community needs and transitioning into action. And so in my perspective, you create that through having exhaustive existing condition documentation, understand the existing conditions of the community as you set out to make the changes. Create a collaborative planning process. Make sure you include a lot of community engagement so you get input and feedback from folks, because we need to have people buy into the plan. There's nobody at the city who can implement the plan by themselves. It's impossible. It's not going to happen in any city. The only way we can make significant changes in community is to have the community lead, have organizations step into it, have individuals step forward, and encourage people to make change. I mean, that's how this happens. We have to do it collectively. And make sure that you have some good, solid implementation tools. So plans should seek to address a broad range of scope. So the main mitigation scope areas tend to be buildings and energy, transportation and land use, and solid waste. There's also emissions associated with some of the other categories like water and wastewater. However, I dump water and wastewater into adaptation because in Minnesota, climate change is, if it's about any one thing, it would be about water. And so how we treat water how we anticipate what happens to our water, and how we protect our water is very key related to climate change. So the other adaptive categories are climate health and safety, food security, local food and agriculture considerations, green space, tree canopy, all things green and growy, our squirrel friends, all of those things. And I identify climate economy. And I think climate economy is very important to consider because these actually are all opportunities. And for us to think about how we might recreate our communities, recreate our society to be fossil fuel free and climate resilient, and to not think about our economy is a real missed opportunity. It's a great opportunity to build jobs, build businesses, create opportunities for ourselves. So some of the solutions related to mitigation, this broad brush speaking at a community level. In our buildings and energy sector, so on the average city in the United States, building and energy is about 58% of the community carbon footprint. In Stillwater, I'm going to guess it's a little bit lower, probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 50%, somewhere around there. But ultimately, what we're talking about is burning of fossil fuels to heat and electrify our homes and our businesses. So the primary things we want to look at is how do we convert to renewable energy? How do we increase our energy efficiency so that regardless of what kind of energy we're consuming less of it, which by the way is also an important adaptive consideration because in the future, as we have increased temperatures, I talked earlier about it's going to increase our air conditioning demand, for instance. So whatever we can do to create more energy efficiency will help us into the future. On things like efficient appliances and so forth. Within our transportation sector, the average city in the country, the transportation sector makes up about 29%. In Stillwater, I'm gonna guess it's a little bit higher than average. I'm going on a limb, no, I could be wrong. And there, of course, we're talking about emissions associated with our cars, our buses, our different mobility choices. And so the things that we can focus on is converting to electric vehicles, especially when we have a clean grid, which in Minnesota, our grid's reasonably clean and it's getting cleaner. So electrifying or other low emission, no emissions like hydrogen. Looking at public transit, fuel switching. So where we still have to burn something, like there are maybe some diesel equipment that's get it onto a biodiesel at least, instead of fossil fuel diesel. And of course, increasing fuel efficiency in whatever fuel we're consuming, whether it's electric or what. Within the solid waste sector, solid waste on average in the United States is about 8%. In Minnesota, it's less. It's usually around 3% in Minnesota. The things that we can focus on is waste reduction, recycling, composting, getting things out of the landfill that will produce methane, and of course, wasted energy opportunities, which, by the way, there are opportunities beyond incineration. Gasification is a good example. Water and wastewater, average in the United States is about 5%. Again, in Minnesota, it tends to be around 2%. So it's a small amount, but it's a very important sector to pay attention to because it is core to a broad range of sustainable considerations. We want to focus on reducing outdoor watering. By the way, the average residence, about 50% of their water consumption is in outdoor watering. I have different feelings about that, but it seems like a good place for us to address. Using water sense fixtures, so water efficiency insight, behavior change, rainwater harvesting, strategies like that. And then lastly, related to climate economy, as I said, all of these represent opportunities for jobs, business development, economic development. So energy efficiency jobs, clean energy transit, training and skills, consumer savings. All of these gestures that we make will save money. So as I reduce my energy consumption, if I switch to solar, if I stop driving so much, those all have a pocketbook effect, which is a positive effect. And it's quantifiable, by the way. Related to adaptation, really we want to focus on infrastructure. So resilience in the face of flooding, resilience in the face of extreme weather events. I don't know if you guys are working like Dubuque, when we were working with Dubuque on their climate action plan, there was a heat wave that came through and they had the streets pop out. The concrete got all broken up. And there was a rail line actually that had a problem at the same time. So resilience in the face of temperatures and extreme weathers, community health and safety, ecosystem health and safety. And in a suburban area, trees are very important. What are we doing with our trees? What kind of ground cover do we have? And social networks and our overall capacity. So making sure that people are connected with each other is very important. All right, so pop quiz.
Okay, drum roll. So we are on question number 4, the last question of the night.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You're the
You have to
perfect
actually
guy.
see the question.
You're the
You
perfect guy.
have to see the question.
Okay. All right. How many pounds of CO2 does an average Minnesotan driver produce? Kind of relates to that last question.
It does.
Depends how much you drive. So the average Minnesota, is it 202 pounds, just under 1,000 pounds, over 8,000 pounds, 25 pounds, or seriously, I like saying this late. Yes.
Better question.
Oh, and these questions, full disclosure, Ted had shared this during a state fair event, right, Ted?
Yes,
It's
yeah.
kind of fun. Go ahead.
Is this average, like annually,
Yeah, average annual emission.
not the whole of your life? Okay.
Yeah, no, that's a good point, because if we're talking a day or a lifetime, no. It depends, it's annual.
Depends on where the cabin is.
That's right.
Depends where the cabin is.
Right. That's right. Yes, sir.
May I ask a question that's kind of maybe off what we talked about a little bit?
Sure.
We talked about mitigating factors. What kind of research is being done for trees and shrubs for like research into hybrids and genetic improvements? So they store more CO2, store more emissions.
So the question pertains to how much do trees absorb the CO2?
Right, and it could be a genetic reason.
Yeah. So broadly speaking, related to climate, carbon sequestration, I've got some knowledge. I'm not an expert related to detailed, botany research that might be going on related to increasing that. If I had to guess, I mean, I'm sure that there is research going on. In fact, I know there is. I remember reading a couple articles years ago about that. I don't know what kind of success they're having. I can tell you that different trees absorb carbon at different rates. And part of that also is, are trees what is going to succeed as a tree in Stillwater today versus what succeeds as a tree in 20 years is changing, because we're changing from a zone 4 to a zone 5, and that's going to keep changing. And I'm sorry, when I say zone, I mean like the hardiness zones, the plants that do well. So the species makes a difference. And also, if you're talking about a baby tree versus a 100-year-old tree, very different, right? So making sure that we're protecting our elder trees is important if we're interested in sequestering carbon. But beyond, what I can say is that for a community like Stillwater, I'm gonna go off on a limb just because we've done, usually we do a lot, we'll do a ground cover study when we're doing a climate action plan, so that we can answer questions like that related to the community. And so I'm going to guess for Stillwater, because we haven't done it for Stillwater, but I'm guessing that based on the tree cover, tree canopy cover, and grass cover, you are probably sequestering, I would say maybe 10% or less. Most communities are actually the average tends to be around 5, but you're a little greener here because of where we're situated, of what your carbon emissions are. So in order to sequester everything that we're currently emitting, that would mean maybe a 10-fold increase in the amount of green growing things, regardless of how, if we found super carbon sucking trees, then maybe it's 9-fold, right? So it just kind of helps put it into perspective, the issue of carbon sequestration. Carbon sequestration is really important. The other thing that we have to remember is that the trees that already exist, there was forest here before the Industrial Revolution. the forest doesn't exist here any longer. We still have the trees and green stuff, but in the meantime, we've increased our fossil fuel emissions. So in order for us to account for sequestration helping us in the battle of reducing our emissions, we have to go above where we're at as a baseline. So whatever we're sequestering right now kind of goes away in the numbers, if that makes sense. We have to go beyond where we are in order to help, push our emissions down.
Are there any really good technical books on good books for not people that are just interested in it that are available? Yes.
Yeah, there are. If you want to give me, I've got cards. I can give you a card. You can send me an email, and I can send you a list of some of my favorites. Yeah.
And Ted, much of the tree sequestration, hard word, that's kind of laid out in a city's climate action plan as well.
Well, we think it should be. It isn't always, but yeah, we definitely recommend it.
Yeah. Great. All right, well, we'll move on.
Alrighty.
Oh, so I wanted to share with you some experiences from the city of Maplewood where I work. And I mentioned earlier that I grew up in Maplewood. So I saw a lot of changes since I first moved there. When I was little, it was farmland, so dating myself clearly. I lived in an old farmhouse, we could run the neighborhood, swim in all the lakes, take hikes in the woods that weren't full of buckthorn, all these things. It was a different time. And so now that I work there, I see these changes happening, and it's troubling, really. In Maplewood, you wouldn't think this, but we do experience some isolated flooding. Of course, we're experiencing some increased precipitation and of course drought, and makes it more susceptible in some areas, those low-lying areas, for isolated flooding. This is a picture in 2011. It was one of our, I guess, biggest floods in Maplewood. We had 20 properties that were flooded. And from that, we had to do this whole extensive flood study. It's outlined in our now comprehensive plan. And we had to make considerable capital improvements and investments. When I first, well, no, this was, I guess, was mid-career here, but we had to actually buy, it was probably 4 single-family homes that we had to buy because they were flooded. And of course, demolish those, and then we had to build it up and redevelop that site. Now it's townhomes, but as you can see, there was a considerable amount of cost to the city of Maplewood because of that flooding that I never saw when I was a kid. I didn't drive down the road and get my car stuck in the water. So that's kind of one example. Another little sample here is clicker guy.
I click it.
Impaired Waters. This is a picture of Wakefield Lake. It's one of 8 impaired waters in the city of Maplewood. And the waters are impaired for sediments, mainly like phosphorus, chloride, our salt use, and then mercury. So of course, the warming of the waters, because of the warming of the temperatures, make them more vulnerable to these impairments. And this is something that I certainly didn't see as a child. And now we work closely with our watershed districts. Of course, they are they're charged with our clean waters in Maplewood and other cities. But we, whenever we do street projects, things like that, we take a look at the surrounding area to see where we can make improvements. And I remember early on, we had proposed rain gardens in some of our parkland, to help manage the surface water that was going into the lakes. And it was quite controversial at that time because people were asking, well, why is there stormwater management in our parks? Our parks are for baseball and softball, and but now it's quite standard. Whenever we're working on a project, we coordinate with the watershed district, our street projects, park improvement projects. anywhere, because we know that we have to continually work to clean our waters. So that's another example. And I'll move on to one more example in Maplewood, of course, invasive species. And in Maplewood, of course, the changing temperatures that we're seeing makes room for these plants that, you know, weren't there when I was a kid. So this is foxglove, non-native, and I wanted to point this out because in Maplewood, we were one of the founding, I guess, participants in the Ramsey County Weed Cooperative, and it kind of led to this Maplewood Plant Patrol. So now we have volunteers out there, you know, when they're hiking, they identify some new invasive plants, and what we found is, you know, when you're able to identify them early on, you know, then you have more success. Whereas, you know, trying to manage the ones that have been here for so long, like buckthorn, it's just a constant battle, and it probably will never go away. But that's nothing that I really thought about when I was a kid in Maplewood, but here we are. So I'll move on to the next slide. And I give you this as an example, and I just wanted to touch on some things because in Maplewood, you know, we had a journey as to how we came to doing any kind of energy or climate planning, because you think, well, is that really a city's charge to be worried about, you know, energy use or climate? Well, you know, when I first started, I never worked on those types of things, but slowly but surely, you know, we began to have more and more policies and plans in place. But I think it kind of all stems from Maplewood's long history of stewardship, environmental stewardship. So Maplewood was one of the first cities that built a nature center. So that was back in the 1970s. And we've had great environmental education there since. However, we had a little hiccup here during COVID, and we did shutter that, but that's for another day, for another speech for another day. But in the 1990s, we saw that development was happening quite rapidly in Maplewood. You know, we are a first ring suburb right next to St. Paul. And the residents of Maplewood joined together and they voted for a referendum, you know, a tax increase to set aside open space within Maplewood. Because they knew if these pieces that were sensitive natural resource areas weren't preserved, that they would be quickly developed. So over probably about 10 years, they had an open space task force that determined which areas of the city they wanted to purchase, and that those funds went towards that. And now proudly, the city of Maplewood has 19 neighborhood preserves that are out there just for natural resources, for, you know, the environmental aspects, for habitat for wildlife. You know, you can walk through the trails, it's peaceful, you know, and it's all right there in a first ring suburb. So that's something that the city of Maplewood residents and our leaders at that time, you know, had the foresight to set aside. So then in 2004, you know, we started seeing a need to look at more and more environmental issues. So the city created what we called at that time an environmental committee. And it was kind of an ad hoc committee that didn't really have any powers to say, but was guiding the city council, making recommendations. And I think of it much like your sustainable Stillwater organization. It was similar to that because it didn't have any ordinance backing, nothing like that. But then the city saw how successful that organization was, or I should say that ad hoc committee, with making some real positive actions within the city. And they actually adopted an ordinance that created the Environmental Commission, and that was 2 years later in 2006. And then in 2007, they're like, wow, we've got this whole commission. What are we gonna do? So they created this environmental planner position, which, as I stated before, I stepped into back in 2007, coming as a city planner, urban planner, working on land use within the city, development proposals, things of that nature. But they started to kind of tap into me to kind of update our wetland ordinance, and we have all sorts of other environmental ordinances that we had to update. So it was kind of a natural fit when I stepped in. But the point of the matter is that they actually created a position that could coordinate and focus on environmental issues only. However, with any position over the years, that's ebbed and flowed, and I've been called back to do this or do that. But generally speaking, it's been working with the Environmental Commission, our environmental policies, our solid waste program, and things like that. And then we said, you know what, why don't we get our staff together and help us out? Because, when you have a group of people working on something, and it comes from that group and it goes up to management, and the management has buy-in, and then the council has buy-in. So we've been pretty successful at working on some city operation level changes, of course, years ago, rolling out a recycling program in the city we didn't have, and an organics collection within city facilities, working on our energy use, reducing energy. And so that's been a really good positive thing that has happened in Maplewood also, that's helped us guide our environmental initiatives. The comprehensive plan is huge. The first one I worked on for the city of Maplewood was in 2009. And at that time, the Met Council didn't call out, oh, we should have a sustainability plan or resiliency. But the city of Maplewood, because we had been working on these issues, created a kind of a standalone sustainability chapter. Now, it wasn't embedded in everything because it was brand new, but it got us a leg up, really. And then, of course, the Green Step Cities program, which I know the city of Stillwater is a participant. They created that in 2010. So Maplewood, we were in a position to say, wow, that is a great program. I mean, if you're going to help guide us with our best practices, and give us resources, this is huge. So we signed on right away, and we've been a participant in that ever since. The city of Maplewood right now is a step 5 city. We were awarded that. I think we were one of the first pilot cities years ago. So again, that has been an absolute benefit. And, when you join in on something like that, you always need a lot of partners, and that's always beneficial as well. In 2011, the city of Maplewood organized its trash hauling. Now, I know that doesn't seem like much here because in Stillwater, you've had organized trash hauling for years. But in Maplewood, it was quite a challenge. It was the first city to organize trash hauling in 20 years under the old statute, which made it quite difficult for cities. You actually had to release this resolution of intent to organize, and it just brought out a lot of controversy right away. And so from Maplewood's experience, they actually changed the statute. So now that cities that want to organize, it's a much kinder, friendlier process where you sit down with the haulers and you discuss and you say, let's work this out together. So there's been several cities since that have organized trash hauling. Living streets policy, that's one way that we get at a lot of our stormwater and urban forest and pedestrian trails, and just taking a look at our street reconstruction and looking at that 60-foot wide width, not just for vehicles driving back and forth, but for everything, for the trees, for the water, for people walking and biking, and so every reconstruction project that we have now follows this policy. And, a real challenge with these street projects is you'll go to a community and you'll say, well, we'll be reconstructing your streets. And maybe it's not that much of a controversy in Stillwater, at least in downtown area where you have a lot of sidewalks, but in the suburbs, outskirts, where they don't have sidewalks, and now you're proposing a sidewalk, well, that's crazy. So we would do that, and the neighbors would push back. Well, now it's like, well, no, it's a policy, and this is our goal to move towards a more pedestrian-friendly city. And so it kind of takes away that controversy because this is a policy set forth by the city council. And so that's been a real success. Green building code. Yes, question.
Is a living streets policy the same as complete streets?
Correct, yes, complete streets. I think we had kind of coined the term back when we were working with the watershed district to kind of reflect that, look at our streets are more for our urban forests and things of that nature.
It's slightly nuanced though, isn't it? That living street is both complete street and green street together.
I was trying to think of a funny green complete terminology, but no, they're the same. Just a nuanced way of saying it. Green building code in the city of Maplewood, we require that all of our city built, constructed, or funded buildings follow this green building code, which has higher energy requirements. And it looks at the whole site, not just the building itself, so that like it looks at the trees and the stormwater. And so we built a couple buildings, a couple fire stations under that green building code, and have done some studies on the energy use, and have found that it's really quite efficient. So that's one way of getting at it, because of course we're funding it, or whenever we do like TIF financing, things like that, those buildings also have to follow that code. And then here was something that I think really changed how we looked at planning for climate and energy. We participated in the Xcel Energy Partners in Energy program. And I think Maplewood was the second city in Minnesota to take that on. And the reason they approached us is because, we had done some other things and met with Xcel in the past. So, it kind of sets you up in this position of people really want to work with you. And we set up this energy action plan, is what they called it. Xcel will help you create a group of stakeholders, and you create this energy action plan for your city. And it's a 2-year plan, and then they'll help you fund and offer technical guidance to help you implement that. And for our plan years ago, we worked on some energy efficiency improvements for buildings in business as well as residential. And we were doing a lot of outreach on that. And that is when I met this guy, Ted Redmond, and I don't know if he likes me to tell the story, but I'm going to tell it because I think it's really inspirational. I think Ted may have been new to the city at that time or something, and he read something about this Partners in Energy and how the city was working on these energy goals. And he called up and he goes, "The city's working on energy goals?" And he said he was so proud to live in a city that was actually working on energy goals. And ever since then, Ted and I have been partners in arms working on some projects for the city of Maplewood. So that's been a great connection. Minnesota Green Corps, we were able to get a Green Corps member to help us with that Partners in Energy. And now our new comprehensive plan, which was adopted in 2019, has a resiliency chapter, which is called out by the Metropolitan Council, but it's also kind of interwoven throughout the plan, because like Ted says, it can't just be one staff person working on that. Clearly, it's all departments. It's our Public Works Department when they're working on the surface water management plan. It's our Natural Resource Department when they're working on whatever, invasives. So it's kind of interwoven throughout the comp plan. And one of our goals was to do a climate action plan. And so we were fortunate enough to sign on to an MPCA grant opportunity with Pale Blue Dot, Ted's company, as well as 3 other cities. And it covered the climate adaptation portion of that plan. So we completed that in 2021. And it's true. And we did this during COVID, so we started out strong. We had this big group of stakeholders from the county, the city, we had residents, business owners, and everyone was really excited for this opportunity. And then COVID hit, and we kind of lost some of the players. But in the end, we made it through, and we have a successful plan. So I'll just move on from there. And I'm kind of leading up to some work that Ted has done for us. So you can see, that's how we got here. And now we started working on some of our climate plans that Ted has helped us with. But I see a question out there.
It wasn't a question, it's an observation of your last slide. I feel like Stillwater's about 10 years behind. And your steps that you've gone through to get to the climate action plan. And I don't know if it takes Stillwater another 10 years before we get one. You might be on that red line.
Well, one thing I want to mention is I did not have sustainable Stillwater backing me up. You know what I mean? So the city of Stillwater is very lucky to have an organization like that. You're very coordinated. I went on your website today. I'm like, wow, they've got different volunteer opportunities, and so if I would have had a team like that, it wouldn't have taken us this long. So.
But we don't have a you.
Yeah, but we don't have a great.
Well, you have all of you. Sounds like a Dr.
But you
Seuss.
were right about the power element, so there's no, we need a power person.
One thing I'll just point out related to getting to the point of the climate adaptation plan for Maplewood. We talked about grounding in science and doing a collaborative planning effort, which Sean talked a little about. It's a big group. But prior to or as a part of the adaptation plan, we started off with a vulnerability assessment. So let's get a good handle on the vulnerabilities of the community. And within that, we also suggest you map out vulnerable populations by census tract. So let's get a good sense of where are our vulnerabilities geographically within the community. Doing a greenhouse gas inventory. And I suggest doing that community-wide as well as municipal operations, because the municipality can help lead. They can show examples, right? And while you're doing that, you want to set up so that that can be done repeated into the future. Because you want to measure now so you know where you start, but of course, every so often you want to measure to see if you're on track or not. So when you do that, setting up, there's, you put tools in place that can be done, more easily, but then also making sure that there's a budget to do it or a person to do it into the future. You don't necessarily have to do it every year, but every 2 years is nice. And then we also suggest doing a ground cover and carbon sequestration study. Kind of answers the question that the gentleman back there had. That you want it because in Minnesota, especially within an urban area or suburban area, trees, buildings, roads, grass, all those things, the proportions of those have a lot to do with how resilient we are. It has a lot to do with our experience over heat, micro heat island effects, all of those. So doing a study to get a good handle on all of those components on a census tract by census tract basis, and then you can relate that back to the vulnerable populations. And you can find out where do we have high vulnerable populations with micro heat island concerns. So you can start saying, well, let's take care of those. And so as you do those, you can then move into a climate, in Maplewood's case, a climate adaptation plan. And then we're all excited to see the development of a mitigation or an energy resilience plan, sort of the sister component. Whenever possible, I encourage trying to do both at the same time. But funding and such, sometimes you do one and then the other, and that's okay too.
So to wrap up Maplewood's experience, what's our next step? So I had mentioned my position, and you're right, it's important to have a staff level person working on these issues, but it can also be championed from any staff working in any department or our leaders. But we did have some staff changes recently. Excuse me, I mentioned COVID and the unfortunate nature center closing. But we started created a new department called Parks and Natural Resources. And so now this environmental planner position is in this new department, which is really just leftovers of the park people. And it's kind of a sad, lonely group, but I'm right there along with them. And but the one benefit is that this position now is back wholly, 100% environmental issues. So I'm not processing garage permits, which is not my favorite thing to do. So that's been a positive change and will help us make some movement towards our climate and energy goals. And then we have this climate adaptation plan, of course, and it is quite comprehensive. It has all sorts of action items in all the areas of the vulnerable populations, the trees, and things that, you know, we normally would work on. As an example, you know, the tree planting and the plan that Ted helped us with. Now, you know, similar to Stillwater, we're experiencing emerald ash borer, so we're losing a lot of our ash trees, and we need to determine where to plant new trees. So we refer to that tree plan, the tree canopy plan, that identifies, you know, there's not quite enough trees in this particular neighborhood, so we concentrate our tree planting there. So these are action items that we're working on, but it gives us a nice guide to move forward. But again, it can't just come from one staff person. It has to come from the city overall, all staff, all departments, but the county, you know, emergency management, our watershed district, you know, it's going to take everyone. And we hope to do this by, number one, we'll start with a climate team, you know, someone that's looking at that climate adaptation plan all the time, checking in on it, making sure that we're making progress. Is that our environmental commission could be? Is that our green team, you know, could be at a staff level? Just making sure that it's not just a plan that's put on the shelf. And then creating those priorities, like, of course, you can't do it all at once, right? So you have to prioritize. What do we think we can accomplish in 2022, 2023? And then a huge component of this, which the city of Maplewood has not really done. I mean, we have like environmental utility fee that helps the city of Maplewood manage our stormwater, but really putting our climate action and energy goals into our budget. You know, it should be part of the whole budget process. So starting in whatever it's spring, when the draft budget goes out, you know, and then it moves on to all the departments and the city council's looking at it. And, you know, there should be an element of our climate planning within that budget and creating a source of funding. You know, we're making improvements. We added renewable energy sources to our buildings. We're saving energy and money that way. Well, let's take that energy savings and put it towards additional projects that will help our climate mitigation. And then strategic plan, I'm sure most cities have a strategic plan. And every 2 years, they kind of refocus on what is important to the city. And we really have to make sure that our climate goals now are included in our strategic plan, which you can see the 6 areas that we focus on now. And then capital improvement projects, again, that's something that every year you look at that and you look out, you know, 10 years, where are the streets that are going to be reconstructed, what type of new buildings do we need, new staff, not staff, but, you know, the capital improvement pieces. So that has to be included in that plan as well. And then I think where we can also make some big changes, because in Maplewood, while we're almost fully developed, we're seeing a lot of redevelopment. So we're looking at these development plans. You know, I looked at one the other day. It was a 100 unit multifamily building. And of course, all the easy lots are taken. So they're starting to develop the challenging lots, which are the ones by the wetlands or that have all the trees. And at any rate, requiring some sort of climate reviews within that planning, you know, because they require conditional use permits and they all have, you know, conditions of approval. So we really need to kind of embed that into that development review. And then, of course, as Ted had mentioned, doing that last piece, which is the climate mitigation planning, which we hope to tackle in the next year or two. And then, you know, I'm not an expert on all this stuff, but I do live in the city of Stillwater. So I wanted to just kind of identify some of the things I've seen. And of course, you've seen this slide before, but it just kind of points out that the city of Stillwater is going to see some changes. And that includes, an increase in temperature and an increase in precipitation. And I think we're already seeing, well, we know we're seeing changes. So we'll point out flooding, of course, is huge in Stillwater, being right on the St. Croix River. And you can see this 2012 federal emergency flood map. It does reflect that a majority of our downtown area is within that hazard zone. So it's areas of flooding. And, in the past, we used to have a lot of spring events down there. And really, they can't count on that anymore. City of Stillwater can't count on that because it's pretty certain that the area will be flooded. So that's, of course, something that's quite visual that you see in Stillwater every spring. And this other example, this is strange. So I was driving down the road and I thought that's a bluff, and they just cut big giant blocks out of that bluff, and that can't be right. There's got to be an ordinance against that. And so I contacted the city, and they indicated that the whole bluff kind of fell down. So then they were kind of required to level it off like that. So,
Where is that? Main Street, Elm Street.
right past Terrace Springs, that road that goes up the hill.
Oh,
And, looking at some developments that are happening, building close, we have a lot of bluffs in Stillwater, and trying to protect those bluffs.
we'll try not to look at those.
So these are challenges that we have here in Stillwater. And one more example. Of course, the tree health, I was reading that it was discovered here in Stillwater in 2018. And that means we'll likely lose all of our ash trees. And in Stillwater, even though the lumberjacks took most of the trees and built our homes in these great old historic buildings, we do still have a lot of large mature trees. And I'm always struck by when there's any kind of tree work in the old downtown area, and these large cranes come and they have to go over houses and pick up a tree, that has got to be a huge expense. And in Maplewood, we're experiencing that, trying to help residents, pay for that tree removal and replacement. And, that's a huge expense for a city. And we're seeing that now here in Stillwater. And then finally, just some tips for Stillwater. I don't know. I think how I was able to kind of figure out how to make some advancements in my position in Maplewood. First and foremost, as Ted said, you can't do it all yourself. So I always try to partner with different organizations like Metro Clean Energy Resource Teams, of course, Green Step Cities, Partners in Energy, because then you're just helping facilitate and they're doing all the work. So having those partnerships is key. And of course, planning, the planning phase, because once you have something in your plan and then now you're applying for a grant, I think that's one of the reasons that Maplewood was successful in signing on to that climate adaptation plan grant with MPCA, is because we already had the goals outlined in our comp plan. And then of course the grants are key. And with all grants, it takes time and commitment, and it usually takes some staff time. And sometimes it takes, matching funds from the city, but really, it really helps focus in on one area of concern. In Maplewood, this is a small grant, but we just received a Metro Cert Seed grant to do some energy efficiency and renewable energy planning with our vulnerable populations. And in Maplewood, we have 3 manufactured home parks. And there's 800 households in those parks, and, you know, many of them are, the residents there are income vulnerable, I guess is the term. So we'll be working with them over the summer to do some education outreach and assisting with their energy burden. So, you know, it just really helped us kind of come up with a program, you know, these grants. And then technical guidance, there's always organizations out there that will help you, like the Green Step Cities and other organizations like Wastewise. I know the city of Stillwater, you're promoting that to your businesses, which is great, but they'll come in for free and, you know, they'll review a business's trash, recycling and organics program, you know, for free. And then they have grant money for those businesses. So there's money and technical guidance out there. And then, you know, of course, I put Sustainable Stillwater on here because that's something that you have here in Stillwater that is really going to help the city move forward. A group of organized and committed residents goes a long way. And then finally, community and leadership support. Of course, I just mentioned the community support, but leadership support, you know, I think that's key. It has to come, you know, from the top down sometimes, or at least you can't hit a wall, you know, and or excuse me, a ceiling, you know, when you get to the leadership level. And that's one area where I think in Maplewood, maybe because that long history of environmental stewardship, that they've been receptive, management level, leadership level, council, commissions, been receptive to taking a look at all of this. And, you know, one example is our organized trash, which was a huge controversy. And, you know, the council didn't have to sit there and take that from the, you know, the angry mob that wanted freedom and didn't want their trash hauler chosen for them, which of course has a lot of environmental benefits. But anyway, so it takes that leadership, and in Maplewood, we were lucky enough to have that. So I think those are all of my words tonight. Oh, except for big reveal. And again, we have prizes. So here are the answers to the questions. An average Minnesotan family of four's diet produces how much greenhouse gases annually? And that is 22,000 pounds. Get out your red pens, no cheating. All right. Having one meatless day each week, the average Minnesotan household could save about 200 pounds of CO2 annually. Well, that is false, because it is 1,256 pounds of CO2 and $728 annually. Well,
Have a trick question there.
yeah, that's a huge savings. How many miles does an average Minnesotan drive in a year? 12,000 miles. About how many pounds of CO2 does an average Minnesotan driver produce? And that's over 8,000 pounds. So we'll just ask. I've got, I think, let's see, I've got 8 prizes. So you almost all get a prize.
If we picked over 1,000 pounds, does that still count as accurate?
Well, I guess that is true. I mean, that is true.
Okay, we will allow that, sir. All right, so who had them all right? Raise your hand. Oh, this is not good. Maybe we won't be giving out all 8 prizes. No. Who had 3 right? Nice. There's a prize for this gentleman.
2.5. 2.5.
2.5. He had a little help. He had a little help. And who had 2 right? 1, 2, 3, 4. Here we go. Prizes all around. Nice job. Yes, happy holidays. And this will help you reduce your greenhouse gas emissions once you open it up. Who had 1 right? Well, you know, good college try. Good college try there. And you get a prize. Who had?
we go.
Thank you.
All right, for the bonus round, okay, we didn't get a prize. We're gonna have you do something to earn it.
Cheers, all right. All right.
Oh, okay.
Can I ask a question, a bigger picture question
Yeah, that's good.
about energy,
Yes.
educate people at the same time? How much is Minnesota? How much does Minnesota roughly use in total energy per year? We'll put it in BTUs, unit of measurement.
Wow. You wanted me to answer
All
that?
right, anybody can answer.
Ah, that's a good stump to
Can
jump
you know it?
question right there.
Everybody know? 1,843 trillion, 2018.
What?
Now, how much of that energy is totally wasted? It's gone. 1,112 trillion BTUs, or 64%.
Isn't that amazing?
Okay? So all the programs, Green Step Cities, Excel Energy, the Conservation Improvement Program at the state of Minnesota, it's not doing anything about stranded rejection energy. So when it comes back to you that you didn't speak to, it's how do we reduce that energy intensity everywhere? And then I mentioned water at the same time. Perhaps the biggest contributor to energy and greenhouse gases. So, want to use numbers, really need to look at the bigger picture. It must be much more urgency. The plans on the shelf thing, Minnesota, the land of 10,000 plans and frameworks, roadmaps. At some point, you got to take the trip. Okay, I've been there for 40 years on this, including the originators of the Green Step program and these other things. Shane, we met once when I presented to your economic development council. So I'm just bringing this up, and it looks like you want to move on. My wife and I just built a 100% sustainable home, Wastewater. No fossils. Okay, and so we're beginning to get that on it. So my point is, really start to think about the implementation. Let's put the plan side apart. Where are the actions? Where are the substantive, transformative actions? Okay, and it could be there. Can I be allowed one example? Sure. Microgrids. You talk about resilient. By the way, I don't agree so much of the parallels between adaptation, mitigation. Lots of reasons, including asking, okay, show me the most transformative adaptation that's resulted in it. But microgrids, when you talk about trees falling on lines and all this, we have an antiquated system. So you begin to adopt microgrids, which some communities are. And what that does is certainly addresses, if you tell me I'm wrong, it certainly addresses resilience. But then it's able then to adopt other renewable energy technologies. Okay, and water, and so a community then builds savings, resilience, economic advantage, etc. So I really encourage folks. I just started working with Sustainable Stillwater, but what I'm going to try to focus on is where are those opportunities. Okay, I want to give one more example. If it's okay. Washington County, but for a while, Ramsey and Washington, I think Dakota, been looking at a methane digester facility. Plans for that. So let's get away from picking up and hauling around a bunch of organics all over the place and turning it into compost. How can we rethink that? So this becomes an opportunity to really rethink those things. And where are those opportunity areas? And how do we bring to bear the collective thinking and programs, et cetera. to move that forward. Where's my soapbox?
I thought you said, where's my prize?
Well, I'll do anything for
Thank you, you earned that prize.
Awesome. We had a question slide up, and just, you know, if there's any questions about anything else issue. That's awesome.
I think we're wrapping it up then, right? So, yeah, thanks everyone, and we're willing and able to take questions.
I have one just to shoot out, just for a comparison. Do you know offhand the size Maplewood population and this area?
Maplewood has approximately 44,000 people, and I can't remember the area. But Stillwater has about
20 square miles.
20 square miles. Sounds about right.
So Stillwater's like 8 square miles and about 20,000.
8 square miles, 20,000. That sounds about right.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, just a comparison. But so a few very detailed things. Does Maplewood have a policy at street trees when they do street reconstruction?
Yes, as part of the Living Streets policy. We, you know what, we had an ordinance that said that you can't plant trees in the right of way. And once we created that Living Streets policy, we changed that ordinance. And, you know, the big thing is who's going to manage the trees in the right of way, and, you know, all that. But now, since 2011, when we created the Living Streets policy, we actually promote it and plant them when we're doing street reconstruction.
People adopt and water them, or?
So we usually have like a 3-year maintenance agreement with the contractors that install them. And then after that, it's usually up to the resident, because of course it's like, you know, maintaining your boulevard when you mow your grass.
My question is, how do we get one of you? An environmental planner in our city? Because we don't have one. And our person that was our green stuff person
Liaison.
just resigned.
And the difference is, you were planner morphing into environmental planner. The planner at the city apparently wants nothing to do with environmental work. There's a real wall there. One planner, the other person in zoning is the one who was assigned to us, but got overwhelmed, I think. In other words, we have an opportunity to bring someone like you in. Maybe that's what we need to suggest, is hire a planner with background in this, because again, that person came from out east, knew nothing about these foundations.
Or would you like to relocate, be able to walk?
There you go.
Reduce my carbon footprint.
She needs a salary.
Well, the city planning,
Well, you know, I'm a taxpayer here, so I'm always concerned about my taxes as well. And I know that creating a new position, you know, it's one of the most expensive things that a city could do. But I think in Maplewood, we kind of had that perfect storm of my degree was actually fisheries and wildlife management, of all things. And I ended up being a planner somehow. And then, so when I started working on these environmental ordinances, you know, I came full circle again. I'm like, wow, this is cool. They're going to create a position. And so then I applied for it. And, you know, so you had someone who had an interest in that area and some experience. So, you know, I think that's key too. You know, you might find someone within the city of Stillwater currently, you know, that has an interest or wants to work on it, or.
If there was a lack of applicants at the time he came in, for example, but I would hope now we could get someone like you, or the current sustainability coordinator, Dinah, blows us away. Shares everything she has with us
Oh, nice.
generously. But it's a magic moment, and it's also about the age of the person at the time, so you can stay with the city for a while. You talk about the perfect storm. You know, we a millennial with a fire in your gut.
Oh, so you don't want an old timer like me?
Well, no.
Just kidding. Also, you know, getting like those Green Corps members or an internship for the summer, kind of, when we organized our trash hauling, we hired an intern to help out. And then he showed so much initiative and interest that it spun off into kind of a position for him. So, you know, that's how things can kind of start as well.
Again, the city wasn't interested in hosting. We've never been in the right position to host, to then get Green Corps. So I'm thinking of intern.
The other thing that I think is, because I totally agree, having a staff person who's addressing the plan is crucial. But I think what can help that is if the council establishes a policy that all departments are going to participate in. Okay? You have an adaptation plan or a full action plan. You kind of identify what department can lead these different actions, and there's something for everybody. And the reality is, if you even have a full-time person, or 2 full-time people, or 3 full-time people, they can't do it. The other departments have to participate.
True.
So just establishing the expectation is that through the budgeting process, you're going to identify your actions for this year, and you're going to talk about what you're going to accomplish, or at least implement. And if that can become a part of the sort of way of being for a municipality, then the staff person can get more done with, you know, less of their time, because they're not on the team of people that are participating.
I understand that, but yeah, that would have to be clearly identified that this is to be integrated into all operations. It is about our operations, and what's the term? Economic. Economics.
Economic development.
I think we have someone who will communicate it, whether a mayor says so or not.
I have a proposal that we put together for the city last week. We said that the city should 200 hours, I think it was.
Yeah, 350, something like that, yeah.
What exactly does the city have to do? 100 hours that could be done by.
Well, technically, it could all be done by an outside organization. The challenge of that is that, so if the plan wants to be ratified, accepted, adopted, approved by the council, then the community just wants to make sure that the process achieves that goal, you know? And so what I found so far, I mean, every community is different, right? So maybe it could be different in different places, but I think that it's probably beneficial to make sure that there's at least enough involvement by city staff to be able to help share how things are working on the inside. You know, it's not like they're trying to hide stuff from us, but I mean, there's way things happen in any organization, right? There's priorities and there's resources and there's problems that they know they want to get to, but they can't. I mean, so just having that sort of connectivity, so that as people are identifying actions, that there's the ability for staff to help us understand where things are going to be a challenge, right? Or where an opportunity lies, you know? So having that connection is very important.
So they got to be, obviously, they got to be kept aware of what's going on. Because otherwise, they're going to talk.
Right.
Like something.
Right.
That's it. Destroy the proposal again. But I mean, with Friends of Lily Lake, we had a neighborhood community engagement process to do strategic vision, which we know 2% of the board to show, but they're being copied on everything they do. So they can correct us if they think they're getting off track. And I'm just wondering if Sustainable Stillwater or get a few other volunteers from the city could do 90% of that 200 hours. So, I mean, they've got to look at something, they've got to understand it, they've got to read it, but how much active stuff that they would put on their time card, would they have to do?
Yeah, so I think, the number that we put in there is just good faith, right? We're just trying to say, well, if somebody asked us for how many hours do you think it is? And, I think
That's what stopped it.
But true, but they tell you how you get to that number. So there should be somebody who's managing it from the city's perspective. Who's monitoring everything so that they can feel confident that when they're standing in front of the city council and say, should we approve this plan? We want that person to say, approve this plan.
Yeah.
Right? So then so there's a person that does that, and that's probably a third of the time. So 100 hours over a year is not that much time, you know. It's a couple of weeks worth of work spread across 12 months, you know. And then the rest of it is maybe, 20 or 30 hours for Department A, Department B, Department C, Department. See what I'm saying? So
That's the regulatory stuff.
yeah, well, they should be, my opinion is that when you have a collaborative planning team, there should be somebody from some of the key departments sitting on the planning team. So that because there will be things to all plans, and this is just the nature of trying to make change, which a climate action plan wants to do, there will be actions that are easy peasy. There will be actions that, okay, that seems, all right, it's a little tough, but it's reasonable. And then there's actions that are like, you want what? Right? I mean, just because that's the nature of creating change. And so having enough engagement that they can feel comfortable with each of those categories and to be able to explain why, all right, I mean, this one feels, I'm nervous about this one, but it makes sense in the plan because of these reasons. So having enough participation in the effort so that it can truly be a municipal plan, I think is important. Now, is it 350 hours? Is it 320? Is it 280? I mean, I don't know. I mean, I've seen there are cities that spend way more than 350 hours on it. They commit the staff time to it. But my suggestion back to the city is, if you have, if you say we got 100 hours, well, then we'll figure out how to use the 100 hours. So if there's a limit, you share the limit, and then we'll figure something out. It may be a compromise to an idealized process, but at least then there's a parameter that you know to work within.
Well, I do feel like we have this opportunity with 2 open positions right now, with our city administrator and whatever Brandon's position.
zoning,
Yeah, so,
but they
Yeah.
have to rewrite it.
so if, considering that, are there certain qualities that we should be suggesting to the city that we're looking for with this, or is it just a position definition?
Sean's probably the most.
So how to suggest to the city in this new position that it should focus a portion of its time
Yeah, job
on
description,
environmental.
or is there certain ways we could start to inch in without it, the full climate?
I
Need a resume filter.